From theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology, this is the Bob Harrington Show. Dr. Robert Harrington is the Stephen and Suzanne Weiss Dean of Weill Cornell Medicine and Provost for Medical Affairs of Cornell University. This podcast is intended for healthcare professionals only. Any views expressed are the presenter's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of WebMD or Medscape.
Hi, I'm Bob Harrington from Weill Cornell Medicine in New York City, and I'm here at the American Heart Association meetings in Philadelphia to have a conversation about an important issue in academic medicine and the whole concept of publish or perish. It's an old concept, but there's some things today that make it very relevant to academic medicine. There's the issue of the ubiquitous nature of data. Data's everywhere, and how do people pull data in and write about it? There's the issue of open access. There's the issues of social media and people wanting to be out in front. There's tremendous pressures on the system. And so I thought this would be a great opportunity at the Heart Association meetings to bring together colleagues who are editors, who are researchers, who are mentors, and get them to give us a perspective on some of these issues that are certainly bubbling throughout the community. So with that, let me introduce my colleagues. Dr. Erin Michos. Erin, welcome. Erin is an associate professor of medicine at Johns Hopkins University, is the editor of a journal for the Society of Preventive Cardiology, and has a lot of experience both as a writer and as a mentor. So thanks, Erin, for joining us. Brahmajee Nallamothu from University of Michigan, professor of medicine, editor of one of the AHA's flagship journals, the Circulation Outcomes Research, also a prolific writer, also a prolific mentor. So thanks to the two of you for being here.
Thanks, Bob.
Erin, we'll start with you. We were talking on the way in. Publish or perish. It doesn't surprise you.
No, I mean, part of this is the culture. So universities, when they're looking to recruit individuals and promote individuals, they look at publications, they look at CVs, and there's tremendous pressure to fill up your CV with publications. And particularly, I look at our trainees, especially international medical school grads who are trying to get into a U.S. residency, our residents trying to get into cardiology fellowship, fellows trying to, transition to faculty. And, these programs look at publications. So there gets to be this tremendous pressure to publish anything. And a lot of times the science that comes forward is rushed and doesn't always, move the field forward or really help advance patient care.
You see papers that get submitted to Circ Outcomes, which are often from these large publicly available data sets, a lot of observational research, where the methods are critical. As a journal editor, you see something coming from a very well-known data set. How rigorous do you have to get as an editorial group to understand, is this right?
Yeah, no, it's something I think a lot about, actually. I think in our role as journal editors, a key part is the observation of trying to understand, when an individual is asking a question through a data set, like not only like the relevance of the question, but how well they even understand the data itself. So a common thing that's been happening lately is, just as you had alluded to in the beginning, the availability of public data sets. Many of these data sets are collected by people who have spent years trying to understand and collect the nuances of this information. One of the areas that I live in now increasingly is in kind of digital health space. And, we're collecting sometimes like billions of cells of data on like hundreds of participants. And there's a lot of noise in those data. And, we try to make our data as publicly available as possible. But one of the worries is someone who's trying to ask an important question, but not understand sometimes the intricacies of those data and then how to interpret them. And, you worry about how that can be interpreted.
I've been called sometimes a data snob because I say, well, in the clinical trials world, we might have worked on that trial for 10 years. And the statisticians who know every intricacies of how the data is connected will point out to you, well, you can't do it that way, Bob, because we didn't collect it that way. Now with NIH rules, et cetera, we're posting those data sets for other people to use. You made a comment about this, that you're worried about this.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of data sets, for example, that ARC puts forward. I'm going to use the National Inpatient Sample as an example. And I publish a lot from this too. It's actually a great resource. It's a subset of U.S. hospitalizations, and it's weighted to try to be representative of national hospitalizations. But there's a number of methodologic issues that, in handling this data. And Dr. Rowan Kara, I think it was in 2017 in Circ Outcomes, they published sort of an outline of important metrics of what you should do methodology when you're handling these data sets. And they did a follow-up analysis. They did a sample of 120 papers, used this data set, and they found that 85% of the papers failed on one of those major criteria, and that many of the papers failed on multiple of those criteria. And so if individuals who haven't had the right methodologic training or mentorship are handling the data and they don't have the nuances of how the sample weighting is applied, the fact that these are hospitalizations and could be the same individual multiple times, and that you're not capturing what's happening in the outpatient, potentially you can get really misleading conclusions by not understanding how to properly handle this big data.
Are reviewers enough in the peer review process to help with this?
Reviewers are a key part of this, but the reality is I think it goes a lot deeper than that. We need to take a step back and learn kind of the responsible way in which to kind of, perform these analyses. I have an old mentor who had a great line about how, it's not just the data, but like now we have the availability of statistical software, and we have much more increasingly complicated methods. And, boy, if you put in numbers, right, and you hit enter, you'll oftentimes get like a regression analysis. How you interpret that, or knowing whether or not you'd actually constructed the model in the correct way, that can be really, really challenging. We just say, well, it made it through a couple of reviewers who might have done it in different ways. I don't think that that's enough. We obviously, like many journals, have a statistical review that's a key part of that. But, once again, the methods are getting more and more complicated. We just came from a session on AI.
I was going to bring up the whole machine learning, press the button, whoa.
I know, and it's really, really getting hard because in many ways, the code for these things can be like, several pages long and very difficult to kind of go through. And then when you're going through it and just like as a text, as opposed to kind of interacting with the code, almost impossible to understand if it was done correctly.
Rob Califf likes to say that one of the most dangerous things in clinical research is a clinician with a rudimentary knowledge of SAS.
Yeah.
Because what he's pointing out is that you have to work with people who are experts.
Yeah.
Do you require the code as part of your review process?
The quote from my mentor, like very similar to Califf, was like, he's like, when you have these statistical, packages now, it's like having the keys to a Lamborghini but no license to drive, right? These things are so slick, these packages, very user-friendly. We have, for a long time, strongly encouraged, like people to share code at least, right?
Deposit it on the web when the paper's published.
Yeah. And data, it's much more trickier. In my own research group, now I've tried to make a commitment in the last few years. If I'm the first, which I'm not as much anymore, or senior author on a paper, we post our code on a GitHub repository. It's good. We have had times when people have interacted and actually talked about the code, but many times, you can't really find strong evidence that people are looking into it. Right. And that might just be our culture, because lots of other fields do it differently.
If you look at something like physics and mathematics, where there's a lot more iteration, papers go back and forth far more than they do in our world.
I mean, it just goes back to the pressure that individuals feel that they need these publications to advance in their career. And universities have created this culture. There was a statistic I saw recently where they analyzed, 4,500 different articles across scientific journals and showed that 45% of these publications didn't have a single citation in 5 years, and only 42% were cited, more than once. And so if a paper is not even being cited, is this science that's changing the field, moving things forward? We want to do research that's going to help advance patient care, help advance science. And so this pressure to do publication after publication, there's this huge industry now with the predatory journals. And so there's been a huge growth in the availability of journals and the number of publications out there. And really, instead of spending a longer time trying to do a really meaningful project, there's been some pressure to kind of churn out as much as possible, and then people end up splicing data into multiple papers, or even things like duplicate publications or frank fraud. When there's just this tremendous pressure that you have to publish to advance in your career.
Well, let's talk about that intense pressure. Before, as you both know, before my current role, I was chair of a department of medicine, so oversaw the residency program. I was amazed every year at looking at the CVs of medical students who are applying for internal medicine residency. Way different than my day, where you might have had something that you had been involved with during the summer in medical school, but they're coming now with five, and I'm not talking about people who have PhDs or who have master's degrees, but 5, 10. And then I talked to my dermatology colleagues, which is one of the most competitive residency programs. They're seeing people with 20, 25. What do you think of that?
And this is part, I think, of the culture, because actually if you're trying to apply and you don't have those publications and people are reviewing, it's almost now expected that if you're applying for fellowship that you've done some kind of scholarly work. And a lot of what we do that's meaningful sometimes is not captured by the traditional methods that they look at. For example, if you're a faculty member and trying to go up to promotion, your publications, your H-index carry so much weight. I mean, the publications are the currency in academia. Not enough credit is given on, for example, those who are doing education and teaching. I mean, it's so important to teach the next generation of scientists, but it's hard to formally capture, good teaching. Universities don't put enough credit on great, patient care and being an outstanding clinician and being an outstanding teacher. We know from our colleagues that are very clinical that it's actually hard to advance in academic medicine if you are a clinician, a full-time clinician on a clinical pathway versus the traditional research pathway with grants and publications. So I think we really need a sort of change, and there has been some seeds of change. You've been a department chair and now in your current role about how we evaluate people in terms of promotion and not putting so much weight just on publications as the whole picture.
Brahmajee, if I'm applying to University of Michigan Cardiology Fellowship Program, can I get in without having a paper to my credit?
It's getting increasingly hard to imagine.
And then how many of your fellows go on to academic careers?
Yeah, no, and I think there's just so much about it. I think Erin's points about, it's really kind of a systematic problem. It's a culture issue. It's how we've chosen to measure things that we can measure but might not be meaningful, right? And that's a big problem that we've gotten into as a community. I mean, you're talking about fellows, right? I mean, I'm sure it's the same with you, Erin. Like I get like at least like half a dozen high school students who will be emailing me, and what I really want to tell them is like, go work in like the Dairy Queen and, go flirt with somebody for a summer. It's like, there's plenty of time to write like statistical analyses of the nationwide inpatient sample, and you don't have to do it when you're 15.
It was out on Twitter yesterday that the youngest presenter at this meeting is 14 years old.
Yeah.
Standing there in front of their poster.
Yeah.
And so there is.
It's impressive.
It is impressive.
But then it's also like, a little.
It's a little daunting for people to say, is that what I'm going to have to do? To be at the Heart Association meetings?
Yeah. So these arms races are just getting, increasingly, higher and higher. And I just don't know. It's a tough problem.
All right. A topic that I've wanted to bring up. You mentioned the H-index. There's the K-index that people have talked about, the Kardashian index. And this is getting at this notion that some people are really good at creating their image, their impact, if you will, through social media. That also has some challenges with both in the academy of measuring whether or not that's of value. I know you've responded to some of these issues. What's your current thinking of the K-index?
Yeah, I mean, that was a sort of fun paper we wrote, but really it was assessing someone's social media visibility, such as their number of followers, with actually, their traditional metric with their H-index. And so there are some people who are huge influencers, but haven't been in the trenches. They haven't really published or done the trials. I mean, it's very easy to criticize trials and you've never run or tried to run a trial.
That's now a professional job, criticizing trials. Yeah.
So, but there, some people who haven't been, sort of this disconnect. Although I do think there is a place for, clinicians and other individuals who may not have published to, give their impact of how it affects their daily practice. But I think there's a larger problem with social media, and it comes to creating this worsening competitiveness. Medicine, particularly cardiology, can be very competitive. And so you constantly see, that person's presenting this and they published this and I haven't done that. And it gets into this trap of comparison. And people feel this tremendous pressure because they see on social media, and we know that social media is not always reality of what everybody else is doing. And so you want to keep up with the Joneses, right? Yeah. And so I think that all of this culture with how competitive academia already is, then puts it in the lens of social media where it's visible to the whole world. And I think this creates all kinds of challenges. And then a lot of my trainees and in young early career end up feeling inadequate, and yet they have decades ahead of them with their career. They don't have to accomplish everything, during, in a span of 2 years, so yeah. It's a real challenge.
But the journals are using social media. You want to push your stuff out. You think you have good stuff. You do have good stuff on circ outcomes. You want to push that out into social media so more people read it. As a journal editor, do you feel some responsibility for the social media piece of it?
Like anything, I mean, social media is a tool, and a tool that can be used and applied in effective ways, and then a tool that can be applied in some harmful ways. I mean, every time I hear Erin talk, I always think how thoughtful she is, because much of this is around younger people and how they, look, at the end of the day, if she doesn't publish another paper, I don't publish another paper, certainly you don't publish another paper, it's not an impact, right? But for younger people, there is this anxiety you can see. I mean, they're still kind of growing and still feeling, these challenges. We try to use social media to kind of be a channel for kind of amplifying many of these folks. But I do worry about kind of the negative aspects of it, for sure. I will say that, even with the K-index, I think there's an underlying truth that is really important, which is that, we talk a lot about the quantity of publications versus the quality, right? And I think that the thing about it is that you can have impact, and there's certainly people, Medscape has many of those people, right, who are online, who, I go to them to say, oh, Orbita 2 just got published. What do so-and-so, what do they think about this? Yeah. And I think that there's a world of importance that we can get through that. So I don't know if you necessarily have to publish, a few hundred papers. What you have to do is, I think, just be able to say meaningful, kind of important things. I have a good friend. He has a great line where he says, you have 100 papers to publish, right? He's like, I know you can publish 500, but you have 100 important things to say maybe in a 30-year career. I've published nearly 400 papers. I don't have 400 things that I've said that are that meaningful, right? Yeah. I mean, the reality is, picking your messages, going back to the quality of what you can say and how you can influence the community, and then being happy with that it's hard, though. Yeah,
that's a really great point. I mean, your point about social media, people ask me, well, who do you follow? I follow people who aren't in my field, so I follow a lot of journals that aren't related to what I do because it helps inform me, and I follow people with good taste in science. And I've learned that there are a few people, to me, Eric Topol's a great example of that. Eric has good taste in science, and so I read Eric's postings to try to understand what's he thinking. Harlan Krumholz, great taste in science, and he reads very different things than I read, and that helps inform what I want to do. We got a couple minutes left. I'm going to ask each of you, you're in charge for a day. What do you want to do to make it better? The publishing world, the academic world. I'm going to be taking notes because I have an opportunity now maybe to make some changes.
Yeah, I think it's going to take some time, but I think we need to shift how we evaluate people, how we're evaluating our trainees that are applying for our programs, how we're evaluating our faculty for promotion, and recognizing a holistic approach of what people are contributing meaningfully to patients, to science, to medicine, that's far broader than just the total output of their number of publications on their CV. And so I think really trying to emphasize more meaningful science, the kind of papers that have multiple citations, rather than the total volume of papers.
The total volume. Brahmajee?
Boy, okay, well, I do sit on our department's promotions and tenure committee, and I will say that it is a lot more formulaic than I wish it were. I've heard about other institutions moving towards ways in which they say, okay, we don't need everything. We know you're at, Cornell or, wonderful place. Tell us 3 things you have done in the last 7 years that you could just write out. 3 things, right? That would be meaningful, right? How have you changed the world? How is the world different because of
Because
the work
of your
you've done.
contribution.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that, bringing it back a little bit to like, I don't know if it's storytelling around that, but I think that in that way we can try to get at, like, again, the things that are really important to us, not just the things that we can measure.
These are good pieces of advice. I've been very impressed with. I don't know if any of you have ever done a review for a UT Southwest faculty member that's being promoted. They call you.
I know.
They don't want you to write a letter.
Yeah.
They want you to give your impressions of this person's contribution to your field, which I have, every time I've had it maybe 2 or 3 times where I've been involved with one of those calls. It's impressive. And they walk you through a series of questions, and maybe that's getting at what you're both saying. Let's try to distill down to what's really important. All right, great conversation. We've had this terrific conversation here in at the American Heart Association, talking about some of the current challenges in academic publication. And in talking to both Erin and Brahmajee, it's pretty clear it's not just publication, but there's an underlying set of issues within academic medicine that maybe many of us in leadership roles ought to be paying attention to. Erin, Brahmajee, terrific conversation. Thank you both.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening here on Medscape Cardiology.